Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. Not everyone is cut out to work in Alaska's North Slope oil fields. After some time, the loneliness wears you down. Months upon months of cold darkness and white tundra. When this occurred, I had been performing pipeline maintenance close to Prudhoe Bay for almost 6 years. February of 2018. Guys like Brad and Tommy, as well as myself, continued returning season after season, because the money was fantastic, really good. Our crew worked well together. Despite blizzards and equipment malfunctions that could have killed you before you could radio for assistance, they had each other's backs. We recently completed a week-long repair project on a segment of pipe that suffered stress cracks from the frequent freeze-thaw cycles during that rotation. Approximately 40 miles south of Dead Horse, just off the Dalton Highway, the corporation placed us in one of those prefabricated shelters. The truckers use that ice road, you know. It should have been a regular drive back. Brad's modified Ford F350, which had chains on all 4 tires and enough heat to prevent you from turning into a popsicle, was the vehicle we had done it 100 times before. While I rode shotgun and kept Brad company as he made his way through what was turning out to be a respectable snowstorm, Tommy was stretched out on the back seat, catching up on sleep. On a decent section, visibility was around 30 feet. You had the impression that you were flying through space as the headlights simply bounced off the swirling snow, creating this mesmerizing white tunnel. About 2 hours into the drive, Brad abruptly applied the brakes with such force that Tommy was thrown through the windshield into the back of my seat. A figure staggered along the side of the road, barely discernible in the storm. There were no emergency lights or cars in the area. Only this individual wearing what appeared to be a large parka, moving frantically and clumsily as hypothermia begins to set in. Brad stopped right away. In conditions like that, you don't abandon someone, not when it's getting worse, and it's 40 below. Tommy awoke and swore at the abrupt halt, but he quickly stopped talking when he realized what we were seeing. For about 5 seconds, the 3 of us sat there, observing this man struggle. 20 yards forward through knee-deep snow, his parka, olive green with fur trim around the hood, was one of those vintage military surplus models that whirled in the wind. His gait immediately caught my attention as strange. Not the stumbling gait of a cold fighting person, but this repetitive, mechanical motion that he seemed to be following a trail, visible only to him. The man didn't even look when Brad honked the horn twice. Simply continued walking ahead, arms slack at his sides, 1 foot after the other, saying, "Jesus Christ, he's going to die out there." Tommy was already grabbing for his door handle. The wind slashed at us like 1,000 tiny blades as Brad put the truck in park, and we all poured out. Despite our bulky equipment, the cold attempted to infiltrate every opening and zipper. We began running in the direction of the man, while shouting, but the storm drowned out our cries. Brad turned him around by grabbing his shoulder when we were within 10 feet. Then strange things started to happen. The man had a pallid face, not frostbitten, but paper white. He seemed to see straight through us with his hazy grey eyes, which resembled dirty ice. His brown beard, which contrasted with his unnaturally white complexion, was probably 3 days old. Additionally, he was continuously moving his lips to produce phrases that weren't allowed for the wine to hear. However, the scar something caused Brad to back off, a sharp line that ran from his jaw to his left temple. It's the kind of mark that indicates someone went through something they shouldn't have. Tommy yelled, "Sir, sir, are you okay?" while pointing to the man's face with his palm. No answer. The man merely stood, swaying a little. Something outside of us, outside of the storm, outside of everything, was the focus of those hazy eyes. His mouth never ceased to move, and I could barely make out what he was repeating when I came closer, defying my instincts that told me to back off. Repeated like a broken record, 247,247,247. Tommy and Brad looked at each other. This was different from the stories we'd heard about people going insane due to the solitude up here. On a level I couldn't describe, this seemed wrong, but we had to get him into the truck. Putting ethics aside, departing we didn't need that, papers, and he would have to explain a frozen corpse to the state troopers. The three of us had to lead him to the fort. He didn't help, but he also didn't resist, simply allow us to manipulate him, a mannequin. Despite the parka, he was cold and stiff. He didn't shiver, which was strange. You know that shivering is your body's last line of defense against the cold. Since you've spent enough time in the Arctic, you will be in trouble when that ends. However, this man's skin was extremely chilly, and he was not even shivering. Tommy, who seemed to be attempting to phase through the far door, pressed himself against it as we got him in the rear, pulling back onto the Dalton. Brad turned up the heat to its highest setting. For roughly no one spoke for 10 minutes. The heater fan running non-stop, and those lips continuing to move and produce those same digits were the only sounds audible. Then Tommy voiced what we were all thinking after clearing his throat. He reminds me of that lost snowmoiler from a few years ago, don't you guys? They never located the body, but they did find the sled. On the steering wheel, Brad's knuckles turned white. I recalled that tale. The slope was worked by all. February 2016. A local man called Christopher Vaughn vanished while riding a snowmobile by himself. About 15 miles from where we picked up our passenger, they discovered his sled coiled around a tree. The seat has blood on it, drag lines that abruptly ceased leading into the woods. Before calling it, search teams searched for 2 weeks. You might have a few hours in that kind of cold without any shelter. They held a memorial service and pronounced him dead. His Christopher had that exact scar from a childhood boat propeller accident, according to his brother, who worked for one of the drilling companies and used to frequent the same Dead Horse saloon. My stomach roiled the more I stared at our silent passenger in the rearview mirror. The scar, face shape, and even eye color are all the same. In the pictures, Christopher's had been brown, but not this milky gray. With its yellow lights barely breaking through the white wall of snow, the shelter looked like a metal oasis through the storm. When we radioed ahead, we received nothing except static, which was normal for this type of weather. The structure was one of those modular pieces that are strewn all over the pipeline routes by oil corporations, essentially a bunk-equipped, kitchen-equipped, fortified shipping container with a communication system. We got ready to take our passenger inside after Brad parked as near to the door as he could. His voice was gritty and incorrect, like someone speaking through water, and that was when he spoke for the first time. Not allowed inside. Not quite yet. Not till to 47. In fact, Tommy jumped and hit his head on the frame of the door, but no matter what they demanded, we weren't abandoning anyone in the truck to freeze. Tommy and I each took an arm, and Brad had to give him a back hug before we could get him through the door. He went dead weight the moment we stepped through the door, almost knocking us all to the ground. We placed him on one of the lower bunks, and Tommy turned on the water for coffee while Brad checked the radio. I remained with our visitor, slowly but steadily taking his pulse and attempting to interpret the information we had discovered. More features were visible up close. In the harsh fluorescent lighting, his fingernails were curled, excessively long, very pale, as if he hadn't trimmed them in months. It worried me more than it should have, because there was no smell, Sweat, body odor, or something else should make someone who has been traversing the wilderness weak. However, nothing was present. Just this lack of smell, neutral, almost antiseptic. Except for one thing that felt my chest clench. His parka pockets were empty. A leather fob with a snowmobile key. The type they offered at the Dead Horse gas station. C was imprinted into the aged and cracked leather. Von 2015. I was holding the key when Tommy returned with the coffee. His face turned pale, and he put down the mugs, causing coffee to spill all over the place. He muttered, "That's not possible," but we both knew it was in my hand. Brad shook his head when he returned from the radio room. Everything was being disrupted by the storm. Until it passed, which was probably another 8 to 10 hours, we were stuck. The power flickered at that point, only once, but enough to get everyone to stare at the ceiling. Power outages were uncommon in these shelters, since they had automatic backup generators. The room had shifted, but the lights had stabilized. Our traveler's eyes were awake, looking straight at the wall clock. 11:30 p.m. this time. His lips moved more quickly as he repeated the same chant. To 47, Tommy took hold of my arm so firmly that it was bruised. "We must leave this place," he remarked, "storm or no storm at the moment." Brad was shaking his head, however, and pointing to the window, where the snow was falling so heavily that it was impossible to see the truck parked 10 feet away. Somewhere in my lizard brain, we were stuck. It seemed to me that was exactly what was meant to occur. Like molasses, the following few hours passed slowly. We took turns keeping an eye on our guest while attempting to appear regular. Brad prepared sandwiches for no one, consumed. It was Tommy's third time cleaning his instruments. I continued to monitor the weather outside in the hopes of seeing some indication of a break. The man remained on the bunk, his lips moving in their never-ending countdown, his eyes fixed on the clock. Around 2 a.m., fatigue struck us severely. Brad and I grabbed bunks across the room, and Tommy offered to be the first watcher. The adrenaline rush knocked me out cold, even though I didn't think I would sleep. Tommy was shaking me wildly as I woke up, his eyes bulging with fear. The time was 2:46 a.m. Brad had a wrench in his hand and was already standing by the entrance. "He's gone," exclaimed Tommy. The bunk was empty when I turned around after a brief moment of averting my gaze to check the coffee pot. We looked entire 40 feet of the shelter, but we couldn't find a place to hide. The man had just disappeared. We heard it at that point. The metal door was knocked on 3 times purposefully. The knock was slow and deliberate, as if the person knew exactly what they were doing. To 47 a.m. The knocking recurred. From the north wall window this time, followed by the south window. Back to the door after that. It circled the shelter, inspecting each entrance as if something were moving about outside. Brad tightened his hold on the wrench. "That's impossible," he declared. We all knew our visitor hadn't exactly been normal, but without equipment, nobody could survive out there. At 2:48, the knocking ceased, and we were left in a perfect silence that made our ears feel pressured. We remained motionless until daybreak. No one is eager to take the lead. Around 7:00 a.m., the storm finally broke. We discovered something that prompted us to rush for the truck. No footprints were found beneath the windows, behind the entrance, or anywhere else in the shelter. The snowfall was immaculate and unaltered. Tommy, however, never reached the truck. He was simply gone when Brad and I turned around. Where he had been standing 2 seconds earlier, there was nothing but empty air, no sound, no struggle, no traces. We rushed out of there and didn't stop until we got to Fairbanks, where we reported the guy missing and didn't mention that he might be Christopher Vaughn. 3 days later, the troopers discovered Tommy's body in the precise location where Vaughn's snowmobile had crashed 15 miles from the shelter. Drag marks on blue, frozen lips in the just halted snow. Music, the nights at the fuel stop at mile 237 went on and on, one after the other, until time became meaningless. I had been working there since early November, where 18-wheelers passed by like ghosts on the ice and frigid wine shook the windows. The Dalton Highway, when I needed extra shifts, the owner, an elderly man named Eugene, didn't ask too many questions, and the work paid well enough for a college student trying to save money. The majority of evenings went off without any problems. Locals filling up their tanks, truckers getting coffee, and perhaps the odd visitor who got lost in the storm. The station itself wasn't particularly noteworthy. A little convenience shop filled with expensive snacks, 2 pumps outside, and a restroom that hardly worked when the pipes weren't frozen solid. On my 3rd Wednesday there, everything changed. The timepiece, it was now 2 a.m. Suddenly, I saw headlights outside piercing the snow. When it reached pump number 4, an ancient Chevy pickup with corrosion eating away at its blue paint job simply halted. The driver remained inside, didn't even switch off the engine, let alone grab his money. Through the frost-covered windshield, he was merely a dark silhouette as he sat there. After 10 minutes or so, I assumed he might have fallen asleep or was experiencing automobile difficulty. However, when I reached for my jacket to see how he was doing, the truck abruptly turned around and vanished into the storm once more. Yes, it was weird, but strange was relative in such a place. Thinking that would be the end of it, I wrote a notation in the logbook and returned to replenishing the energy drinks. Another blizzard, far worse than the previous one, came the following Wednesday. The wind caused the entire building to sway like an ancient ship, and visibility decreased to about 20 feet. These were the kinds of nights Eugene had warned me about. Even truck drivers would burrow down rather than risk the highway when the weather got so terrible, according to the statement. In an attempt to keep myself occupied, I was counting merchandise in the back room when I heard the familiar an engine rumbled outside. The wall clock read precisely to seconds before the hour. I saw the identical blue Chevy pull up to pump 4 through the security monitor. The driver was in the same location as before and took the same action. Of course, nothing. I was able to see more details this time since I had a better camera angle. At exactly 10:02, the man's hands clutched the steering wheel while he wore what seemed like a heavy winter coat with the hood up. He never seemed to breathe, never grabbed for the radio, and never changed his position. This time, I waited 15 minutes before I made the decision to confront him. The truck's reverse lights came on as soon as I moved toward the door with my keys in hand. The only thing left were tire prints that the storm had already wiped out by the time I forced my way to pump 4 through the wind and snow. I was uneasy about the entire situation for reasons I couldn't fully articulate. He moved in a way that was mechanical or not like someone viewing a video repeatedly. The blue Chevy didn't come back, but I jumped at every set of headlights that went by for the remainder of my shift. I brought it up to Eugene when he arrived for the morning shift, him attempting to sound informal. He simply shrugged and added, "We got all kinds out here, especially during storm season." However, I saw that he drummed his fingers uncomfortably on the counter and avoided establishing eye contact. By Wednesday the 3rd, I was ready. Jasmine and I had even switched shifts so that I could arrive at 2 a.m., but I kept the true reason from her. The station's security system was antiquated, but nonetheless operational. An early 2000s setup that continuously recorded everything and erased footage for the 7 days. I had a USB drive ready in my pocket and had figured out how to save clips to it. Better vision was possible because the storm that night was milder and only consisted of constant snow rather than a full-on blizzard. I pretended to read a magazine as I waited, positioning myself behind the counter so that I could see pump 4, 1:58 a.m. I heard it coming from the north, the characteristic rumbling of engines getting louder. With practiced accuracy, the blue Chevy pulled into the same location after appearing out of the shadows as if called. I was prepared this time, using the camera controls to zoom in as closely as the outdated setup would permit. My skin crawled at what I saw. The man behind the wheel wasn't simply motionless. He remained still. Not at all shaltobu motions from respiration. No moving to settle in. No checking of mirrors or fidgeting. His hands on the wheel appeared off in some way, but his face was still hidden beneath the bulky hood. The skin was rather grey. Even taking into consideration the low quality of the camera, and the fingers appeared excessively stiff, as if they had been frozen in place. I watched him sit there for precisely 10 minutes while my heart pounded, recording everything. The reverse lights then turned on as planned. However, this time, the vehicle twisted slightly and briefly moved to the driver's side instead of backing out. Aimed straight at the camera, I stumbled backward into the cigarette display after catching a glimpse of his face through the hood that had fallen back just enough. Though incorrect, the traits were human, an expression of total nothingness, sunken eyes that reflected no light, and skin that resembled worn leather. There was no sign that a living person was behind the wheel, no emotion, no recognition. Before I could gather my thoughts, the truck disappeared into the night. The following hour was spent watching the video again in an attempt to persuade myself that I had misinterpreted what I had seen and that the outdated camera and bad lighting had deceived me. Each viewing, however, simply strengthened my first impression. It wasn't right anybody or whatever was sitting in that truck. I began browsing through the station's old logbooks, going back months and eventually years, and saved several copies of the tape. In a storage cupboard behind the break room, Eugene maintained thorough records, dusty binders containing incident logs, maintenance reports, and delivery schedules going all the way back to the station's 1987 founding. I discovered the first reference at that time, in December 1993, in a note addressing a customer's complaint about an abandoned car at pump 4 at 2 a.m. hour. The description was just right. The guy driver of the blue Chevy truck never gets out of the car. Thereafter, the entries came in spurts. During winter storms, on Wednesdays, and at precisely 2 in the morning, the great surprise was seeing, hidden under the earlier records, a folder titled Incident Reports, Law Enforcement. Within were newspaper clippings, missing person flyers, and police reports that were photocopied. One quickly drew my attention, a January 1992 article on Walter Ricks, a local guy who vanished. During a strong blizzard, he was on his way home from work at a mining camp when his 1988 Chevy, which was blue, somewhere along the Dalton Highway, Silverado, disappeared. Despite intensive attempts, search parties were unable to locate him or the car. There was a picture of Walter in the piece, and I could see his sunken features even in the grainy newspaper copy. However, the final file in the folder caused me to drop everything and grab my phone. 2 years ago, someone ran the truck's license plate and attached the results. Walter Ricks owned the license plate, which DMV records show was registered to a car that was reported missing in January 1992, more than 30 years ago. Eugene's phone went straight to voicemail when I tried to call him. The following Wednesday was only 2 days away, and I was undecided about staying to face whatever kept coming back to Pump 4 or quitting right away. Curiosity triumphed, accompanied by an odd sense of duty, as if I had to know this for Walter's sake, wherever he actually was. During those 2 days, I looked into the disappearance as much as I could. Walter, who worked alternating shifts at the Red Dog Mine and left behind a wife and a baby daughter, was 28 years old when he disappeared. The blizzard that night, with visibility close to zero and temperatures falling to 40 below, had complicated the hunt. The police report contained one noteworthy detail. In his final radio message to the mining camp, Walter indicated stopping for petrol, but he did not say where. According to the chronology, He would have been close to mile 237 at 200 am, exactly when the storm peaked. In the newspaper archives, I also found something else. Over the years, 3 more persons had vanished along that section of highway. All late at night, all amid winter storms. They were never located. On Wednesday, the temperature was around -20. The skies were clear for once, and the stars were visible through the station windows. I had persuaded myself that whatever had brought Walter's truck back only brought the storms, and that perhaps the clear weather would break the trend. However, at 1:45 am, snow poured in thick, heavy sheets as clouds unexpectedly moved in. Visibility has nearly disappeared at 1:55. I also knew he would arrive. I had everything ready. I had a baseball bat from the storage area hidden behind the counter, Eugene's number on fast dial, my phone fully charged, and new batteries in my flashlight. Precisely to Zord, through the snow, the recognizable headlights shone. The Walter, or the person who used to be Walter, waited behind the wheel in his perpetual vigil as the blue Chevy rolled up to pump 4 with the same mechanical precision. So I didn't wait this time. I snatched up the flashlight and the bat, inhaled deeply before pushing out into the storm. My eyes started to water and my breath was taken away by the cold, which struck like a physical force. The landscape became a white nothingness as the snow swirled in erratic patterns, interrupted only by the idling truck and the faint glimmer of the station lights. I saw something that hadn't been evident on the cameras as I made my way to pump 4, struggling against the wind with each step. Around the truck, the snow fell in a perfect circle with no flake touching because it fell in various ways. The car, stranger still, there was no condensation from body heat or fog from breathing. On the windows, the interior appeared to be as frigid as the outside air. With my flashlight beam striking that awful visage in profile, I made it to the driver's side door. Walter's features were much more unsettling up close, skin stretched over bone-like. Ancient parchment, there were open eyes, but they saw nothing. As if paused in mid-sentence, lips parted slightly. Everything took a turn for the worst when I lifted my hand to knock on the window. The electricity to the station went off the instant my knuckles touched the glass. The pump stopped working. The structure behind even my illumination flickered and died as I disappeared into the darkness. I heard the vehicle door crack open for the first time in that sudden darkness. The darkness continued even though the emergency generator should have started up in a matter of seconds. I staggered back, wildly swinging the bat in an attempt to with numb fingers. I turned on my flashlight again. Then, incredibly, I noticed light emanating from the station's inside. There was a gentle, mellow glow coming from the windows instead of the sharp fluorescence. I could see a figure standing inside, motionless, staring out through the snow. To tall and to skinny were the incorrect proportions. However, I recognized the sunken face and the thick winter coat. Walter was standing on the wrong side of the front glass, inside the lock station, looking out at me. From his vantage point, frost smeared the glass in elaborate designs that slithered outward like icy veins. The most scary thing was that I could still hear the truck's motor running steadily and smoothly as it idled behind me. Just enough to corroborate what I already knew. I turned my head. The door hung open like a mouth, and there was no one in the driver's seat. As I gazed, I could see every aspect of Walter's disfigured face since he had gotten closer to the glass back at the station. My chest tightened with terror as those vacant eyes stared at me with such intensity. I shall always be haunted by the sound that followed, a speech muffled by the sound of wine through a frozen pipe the glass, but it's understandable. Still searching for the 4th pump, every syllable was strained and slow, and as more frost slid across the window, the storefront turned white with ice. I slipped on the snowy ground and retreated. The bat was worthless in my trembling hands. The truck's headlights flashed in a cadence that sounded almost like Morse code as the engine behind me abruptly revved. The station's faint light started to pulse in time with the illumination. Walter wasn't alone in there, I realized with increasing terror. Behind him, shadows moved. Walter was one of 4 figures in winter clothing standing at the windows, matching the number of missing people I had heard about. Their mouths moved in unison as they all gazed out with the same vacant eyes, to create words that were too loud for me to hear above the storm. Ice letters started to form from the frost on the windows. Please show us the route. I took off running. Not to the highway, not back to the truck, but around. I struggled with my keys as those lifeless eyes followed me through each window as I made my way through the building to the employee door. At last, the door gave way, and I rushed inside, tossing the deadbolt and slammed the door behind me. The store was deserted, until the emergency lights abruptly came on. No frost on the glass, no figures at the windows, except for my own heartbeats hammering. Everything seemed normal. However, the truck remained outside. At pump 4, I could hear it idling. With shaky fingers, I dialed 911, rambling about power outages and intruders, anything to get someone else there. I took the USB disk containing the video and shoved it in my pocket while I waited. Then I saw something that sickened me. The wall clock read to 47 a.m. However, my phone indicated that the power outage had barely lasted 10 minutes. Nothing was discovered by the responding officer. No truck, just my footprints. The windows are not damaged by frost. I resigned, packed my belongings, and departed Alaska completely the following morning. However, I still occasionally dream about Pump 4 and those phrases written in ice on winter nights when the snow falls heavily. What they were searching for eluded me. To be completely honest, I pray I never do. Everything between my dad and I altered in October 2019. We had spent months organizing this moose hunt in the Copper River Basin of Alaska. It was our first genuine father-son vacation since I had relocated to Seattle 3 years prior for work. As a 28-year-old consultant, I must admit that I haven't spent more than a weekend with the elderly man since college. He had spent more than 20 years hunting in that area. As if they were extensions of his own garden, he was familiar with every ridge and creek. We took his reliable Chevy up from Anchorage, Silverado, camping equipment packed tightly, rifles fastened. We were both really looking forward to spending 5 days in a row away from the outside world. It looked like a simple plan. Without phone towers or work emails rattling in our pockets, we can appreciate the environment while tracking some moose and possibly landing a clean shot. The first day went just as planned. After hiking about 6 miles from where we had parked, we came across a good campground close to this small creek that sliced through a valley that was thick with birch and spruce. As he pointed out animal indications, described wind patterns, and related tales of past hunts in the area, Dad exuded the self-assured swagger he always had in the woods. With beautiful skies and that ideal autumn light coming through the trees, the temperature was perhaps 35 and brisk, but not harsh. We arranged our equipment, pitched our tent, and spent the drinking a thermos of whiskey-spiked coffee in the evening as we planned our route for the next morning. Everything seemed regular, even serene. We were both worn out after the hike, and we were quietly discussing work-related stress, family matters, and life in general. We were already being observed, but neither of us realized it. On the second day, the strangeness began. We had spent almost 3 hours hiking along this game track, which went past several rocky outcrops. Dad was staring at something approximately 30 yards ahead when he came to a complete halt. His attitude changed from one of casual attention to one of sincere perplexity. I saw what had captivated his attention when I finally came up to him. Pieces of what had once been a caribou were scattered, but it wasn't like any kill I had ever seen. The bones were chosen with surgical precision and immaculate cleanliness. The arrangement of the components, however, was peculiar. They were not dispersed at random, as would be the case with a typical predator death. Rather, they created this strange pattern, as if they had been purposefully arranged in a rough circle around a level rock. The skull occupied the vacant sockets, in the middle, gazing up at the gloomy sky, while the bigger bones spread out like a wheel's spokes. Dad knelt by the remnants and ran his fingertips along the crisp edges of the bones. During his more than 2 decades of hunting, he witnessed numerous bear kills, wolf packs feeding, and even attacks by mountain lions. However, this was distinct. The soft dirt surrounding the spot had no tracks, and the bones were neat and well organized. Not even a scuff mark or a half-paw print. He whispered, "Kevin," using my entire name, which he only used when he was really worried. "I've never seen anything like this. Whatever did this is large enough to kill a mature caribou, but it's also clever enough to leave no trace." We circled the area for 10 more minutes, finding nothing at all, no blood, no fur. We attempted to shake it off and resumed our quest, but the finding had obviously shaken both of us. Track, no disruption in the surrounding plants, as if the animal had just appeared, laid these bones with surgical precision, and then disappeared into thin air. Looking back toward the bone site, I noticed that I was looking through the tree line more often than usual. We discovered another kill about 2 miles up the trail. This time, it was a ptarmigan, but the remains were still arranged in that same strange way, with the tiny bones creating a perfect little circle around an even more unsettling aspect of it was that, although ptarmigans are ground birds and therefore easy prey for foxes or hawks, there were no feathers scattered about, no indications of a struggle, and the small skull was perfectly positioned in the center of a smooth river stone. "This is surgical labor," Dad whispered, hardly raising his voice above a whisper. "No animal does this kind of precision cleaning naturally." He held up one of the fragile wing bones to the light, demonstrating to me how cleanly it had been stripped of meat. Throughout the day, we discovered 5 more kill sites, each more eerie than the last. A ground squirrel positioned in a perfect circle around a flat piece of shale, surrounded by a piece of quartz made of marten's bones. Every site was spotless, almost sterile, with the same uncanny accuracy that raised the hair on my arm. Dad began to walk differently, keeping his rifle ready, constantly checking behind us, and the last few sightings still had that metallic smell of recent death clinging to them. The escalation was what really got to me. The kills were getting fresher as we moved deeper into the basin, and the first caribou had been there 4 days, maybe weeks. It felt like we were being led deeper into its territory, following a trail of increasingly fresh kills that were both warning and invitation. That night, we camped in a small area, and although neither of us wanted to say it aloud, we both knew something was following us, staying just far enough ahead to prepare these hideous displays for us to find. Dad insisted that we keep the fire going all night, taking turns on watch, even though we had never done that on previous camping trips. I drew the first shift, sitting with my back against a fallen log, rifle across my lap, and listening to every snap of branches. The clearing was surrounded by thick spruce trees, and we were both nervous to go farther. At around 2 in the morning, when Dad was on watch, I woke up to the sound of him feverishly whispering my name, and when I opened my eyes, I saw that he was "Don't move too fast, but tell me what you see." He pointed to the other side of the clearing, his face pale in the flickering orange glow, where he breathed between those 2 large spruces. I carefully rotated my head, following his gaze, and that's when I spotted them to massive yellow eyes that reflected our firelight, standing about 8 feet off the ground, totally still, not the usual green eye shine you'd expect from a deer or moose, but this vibrant, almost golden hue that looked to be pulsing with intellect. Dad had his rifle trained on the spot, but we couldn't see any body shape or outline in the darkness behind those eyes, which watched us for what seemed like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes. The eyes never blinked, never moved, just kept that steady, calculating stare that made my skin crawl. Whatever it was that was watching us was enormous. The oddest thing was how completely calm it was. No breathing noises, no foliage movement, no shifting of weight from one foot to another, and that the eye positioning alone suggested something much larger than any wolf or bear I'd ever seen. When dawn finally broke and the first grey light began to creep through the woods, those unblinking eyes disappeared, as if they had never been there in the first place. They were watching us with what seemed like predatory patience. After we had enough light, we searched the area extensively, but we couldn't find any tracks, disturbed vegetation, or tangible signs that anything had been there. However, on day 3, everything changed. After about 4 hours of hiking, we were both jittery and worn out from the restless night when we arrived at the ridge line that overlooked the main valley. Dad abruptly became quite rigid while searching for moose signs with his binoculars. With trembling fingers, he handed me the binoculars and murmured, "Jesus Christ, tell me I'm not going crazy." It was there when I changed the focus and glanced in the direction he was pointing. It was the biggest wolf I had ever seen, standing on the opposite ridge, perhaps 800 yards away, but it was too big to be called a wolf. It was easily the size of a small horse, with a huge head and shoulders that seemed too wide for any typical dog, and its fur was nearly black, except for my heart raced when I noticed that the wolf stood motionless, facing us as if it had been waiting for us to arrive at that precise location for perhaps 2 minutes, simply observing us through what must have been its own extraordinary vision, except for these strange silver markings along its spine that glinted in the sunlight like metal. Dad was fumbling with his rifle, trying to get a clear shot, but the range was too far for any reliable accuracy, and even at that distance I could feel the weight of its attention, as if it were cataloguing every detail of our appearance and behavior. Then, without any warning or slow movement, the wolf turned and started walking along the ridgeline with this fluid. Almost the thing that scared me the most was how it would stop every 100 yards or so, turn back toward us, and wait just long enough for us to follow its movement before continuing. It was a flowing gait that didn't look natural. It moved like liquid shadow, covering ground impossibly fast while maintaining perfect balance on terrain that would challenge even an experienced mountain climber. It was obviously proving that it could outmaneuver us with ease, that it had been in charge of this whole encounter from the start. And then everything made sense to me. The arrangements of the bones, the increasingly recent kills as we went farther into the basin, the quiet nighttime surveillance, and now this deliberate show of power. This was something considerably more clever and purposeful than a random animal defending its realm. We were being hunted by it, not hunting in its territory. Dad must have come to the same conclusion, because he grabbed my arm and shouted, "We're leaving right now." The wolf had been following us the entire way, staying near enough to keep an eye on our movements, while dropping those hideous calling cards to signal its existence. We've been toying with this thing. The wolf was still there, sitting now, like some ancient sentinel, watching our retreat with what I swear looked like satisfaction. We packed up our gear with frantic efficiency, giving up any pretense of continuing the hunt, and I couldn't help but take one last look through the binoculars as we began our descent back toward the valley. We walked for 6 hours straight to get back to our truck, both of us monitoring the tree and ridge lines around us. We didn't talk much on the descent, but I could tell Dad was thinking about the same disturbing realization that was bothering me. The huge wolf had been every kill site, odd bone arrangement, and moment of mounting anxiety had been meticulously planned to lead us deeper into its domain until it was ready to emerge. When we finally arrived at the Silverado, Dad threw our gear into the bed with trembling hands and turned on the engine before I had even shut my door. We never returned to that area, and the following spring, Dad sold his hunting gear. Neither of us ever discussed what we had experienced, but I know we both felt those golden eyes following our every move as we drove away, watching the wilderness fade away in the side mirror. Realized that we had come across something that shouldn't have been there, an apex predator with almost supernatural intelligence, and that we had been extremely fortunate to escape its territory unscathed. The caribou migration project seemed like the ideal way for me to further my wildlife biology career. I finally got the opportunity to lead a team investigating how climate change was affecting traditional migration routes near the Yukon River. After 6 years of smaller research assignments, the assignment came through in late April 2017, and 2 weeks later, I was traveling into the Canadian wilderness with a 5-person research team to monitor 43 GPS-collared caribou over the course of 3 weeks, recording their movements and behavior patterns. The information we gathered could potentially impact conservation policies throughout the region, making this one of the most significant projects I had ever worked on. As we loaded our equipment, I recall feeling a mix of responsibility and excitement. We set up our base camp in an old logging site that had been abandoned somewhere in the 1980s, which was a perfect place for our research. Thermal drones, tracking equipment, and camping supplies for an extended stay in some very remote territory. Situated directly along one of the main caribou migration corridors, with flat ground for equipment setup and close proximity to the river for water access, the place had an eerie atmosphere that I couldn't get rid of, with rusted machinery half buried under decades of moss and fallen leaves, and decaying wooden structures slowly giving way to the encroaching forest. Dr. James Mitchell, our seasoned project manager, Lisa Chen from the university's wildlife department, and 2 graduate students, Alex and Maria, made up my team. Because we had worked together on prior projects, we had a set procedure for setting up our campsite, which was distributed every day. The work itself was methodical and rewarding, and we got into our research routine. The first few days went exactly as planned, with clear, consistent GPS signals streaming in from all tagged animals. We checked our tracking systems every morning, while sipping coffee around the portable camp stove, watching dozens of the caribou were following their expected routes, clustering in feeding areas during the day and moving steadily northward each night. Lisa managed the thermal drone flights, taking behavioral footage to supplement our GPS data, while Alex and Maria alternated. Red dots move across our digital maps as Dr. Mitchell and I updated our field notes and examined movement patterns. We kept an eye on the radio frequencies. The weather remained consistent, with cool mornings, mild afternoons, and clear nights ideal for operating the equipment. The routine was pleasant, predictable, and everything was proceeding as intended. By day 5, we had recorded some intriguing departures from past migration patterns, exactly the type of data that would make our research worthwhile. Small details about the abandoned logging site that had not been immediately obvious began to catch my attention in those first few days. The concrete foundations of buildings that had been demolished formed geometric patterns, and some trees had these perfectly straight cut marks that were too precise to be natural, indicating the loggers had used some sort of sophisticated equipment for their time. Most interestingly, we discovered a number of metal plates buried beneath decades of debris, each stamped with sequential numbers, but lacking company identification or dates. The patterns appeared almost intentional, as if the person who created the original layout had a specific organizational system in mind. However, this location was different, almost sterile in how thoroughly it had been cleared of identifying information. However, it didn't interfere with our research, and we had more important concerns than examining the site's enigmatic past. It was mentioned that logging operations from that era usually left more obvious traces, marked trees, equipment serial numbers, and proper signage. On the evening of May 15th, everything changed. At approximately 11:30 p.m., when I was in my tent going over data logs, Alex ran from the monitoring station, his face pale in the lantern light. "Heather, you need to see this right now," he remarked in a worried tone, as all 43 GPS signals vanished at precisely 11:17 p.m. Not piecemeal, not one by piece. Lisa performed diagnostics on our receivers, while Dr. Mitchell examined the backup systems, but everything on our end was working. The tracking system displayed no error messages, no equipment malfunctions, and no technical explanations for the abrupt blackout. It was as if someone had flipped a switch flawlessly. Over the course of the following 3 hours, we tried to restore contact by changing frequencies, boosting signal strength, and even manually pinging individual collars, but to no avail. The caribou had just disappeared from our monitoring network, leaving us to stare at blank screens and wonder what the hell had just happened, and the calm that followed was unlike anything I had ever encountered in the wilderness. Normally, at night, the Canadian forest is a flurry of activity, with little animals moving through undergrowth, limbs cracking, and owls calling. We decided to take shifts, watching the equipment through the night in the hopes that the signals may return as strangely as they had departed. But once they did, even those familiar noises seemed to fade away, replaced by an oppressive calm that made my ears ring. Doctor, when it was my turn at 4 a.m., I sat by myself in the monitoring tent, surrounded by silent apparatus, trying to make sense of what had happened. Mitchell had the first watch, then Lisa, then Alex. I kept looking through our data logs, hoping to find some pattern or explanation that we'd missed, but dawn brought no relief, just more questions. The GPS system had never failed so completely before, and the timing, with all signals cutting out at the same moment, suggested something far more serious than a simple technical glitch. The trek through the forest was tense, with everyone engrossed in their own thoughts about what we could find. We packed up quickly and set off to the last known position of the nearest caribou herd, which was around 6 miles northeast of our camp. When we arrived at the area, there were no animal traces, droppings, or other indications that the animals had ever been there, but our equipment was in the same location as when we left it the day before, with cameras, motion sensors, and even backup GPS devices all operating correctly and continuing to record data from their places. It appeared as though the caribou had just vanished, leaving only the equipment we had used to track them. Lisa proposed that we broaden the scope of our search, but Dr. Mitchell was already becoming concerned about our budget and schedule. We searched a 12-mile area all day, finding nothing but bare wilderness and the increasing certainty that something extraordinary had happened. That night, Lisa decided to watch the thermal drone footage from the night before in the hopes of gaining some insight into the caribou's fate, and we huddled around her laptop in the main tent, watching hours of blurry infrared footage. The most of it displayed the typical thermal indications of a peaceful wilderness night, such as an empty forest and sporadic tiny creatures moving through the underbrush, but around 11:15 p.m. to minutes before the GPS signals vanished, the video showed something remarkable. 7 towering figures that were unmistakably humanoid, but somehow incorrect to rose out of the trees and moved across the open space next to our tent in perfect unison. The most unsettling aspect was how they moved together like a single organism with multiple parts, maintaining exact spacing and identical movements as they crossed the frame and vanished back into the forest on the opposite side. The thermal signatures revealed that they were warmer than the surrounding environment, but cooler than the average human body temperature. They were also coordinated, moving with a fluid precision that seemed almost mechanical. Alex kept saying that the equipment must have broken, but Lisa and I both knew what we were witnessing was true, and we didn't talk for a few minutes. After the tape ended, Dr. Mitchell rewound it 3 times, examining every detail. The thermal imaging was the figures were about 8 feet tall, with elongated limbs and movements that suggested they were intimately familiar with the terrain. They made no sound that the drone's audio equipment could detect, moving across fallen logs and dense undergrowth without disturbing a single branch. They were too consistent and detailed to be some sort of technical glitch. We watched the video dozens of times, but it only made us wonder more about what we were dealing with and whether it was real. What really troubled me was their coordination, not just walking in formation, but actually mimicking each other's movements down to the smallest gesture. When the lead figure raised what looked like its arm, all 7 simultaneously performed the same motion in connection with the disappearance of the caribou. We instituted a buddy system that night, ensuring that no one was left alone in their tent and establishing hourly check-ins until dawn. In spite of our precautions, I hardly slept, listening to every sound outside and wondering if those figures were still spying on us. In the tent next to mine, I heard Maria whispering urgently to Alex at around 3 in the morning, but when I called out to check on her, she claimed to have had a dreadful dream. The remainder of the night went smoothly, but when we got again for breakfast at 7 a.m, Alex was gone, and the morning brought a fresh horror that made the riddles of the previous day seem insignificant. We explored the local area surrounding camp, shouting his name and looking in all the locations he may have wandered during the night, but his boots were gone, his sleeping bag was empty, and his personal items were still neatly organized beside his cot. Dr. Mitchell was already discussing Alex's hiking boots were mathematically positioned on a flat rock, perfectly parallel to each other, and facing directly toward the flowing water. I decided to check the riverbank, thinking perhaps Alex had gone for water and slipped on the muddy slope, but what I found at the water's edge defied every rational explanation I could think of, prompting me to call emergency services. The rock they sat on was completely dry, even though the morning mist had dampened everything else in the area. The laces were tied in neat bows, exactly as he always wore them, he said, and there was not a single scuff mark or piece of mud on the leather, but there were no footprints, neither leading to the boots nor away from them, in the soft riverbank soil. I gathered the others, and we spent 2 hours searching every inch of the surrounding area for any indication of Alex's path. The lack of tracks was unavoidable. Even if footprints had been purposefully removed, there would still be evidence of the removal. We immediately packed up camp and hiked back to the closest communication point to call the authorities, but the boots remained like a neatly arranged display, as if they had been placed by someone who could move without touching the ground. The search and rescue operation took 4 days, involving tracking dogs, helicopters, and skilled wilderness teams, but no Alex's boots were dismissed as unimportant details by the investigators, and 6 months later, I got a call from a forestry worker who had been conducting surveys in the same area. The official report listed Alex as missing, presumed dead, with the working theory being that he had somehow fallen into the river and been swept away by the current. A GPS collar that was still operational and had remained stationary in that precise spot since May 15th at 11:17 p.m. was discovered by him buried beneath a mound of stones close to the former logging site. I never returned to that location, and I have never worked on another research project in that area. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Every time someone mentions Alaska, my stomach turns to knots. It was one of the collars from our missing caribou, and the timing coincided perfectly with when all the signals had vanished. People often envision the stunning wilderness and breathtaking northern lights, but all I can think about is that night at Copper Creek Lodge. I had just finished my junior year of college when I accepted a seasonal position as a maintenance assistant and front desk clerk at this small, isolated lodge close to Wrangler St. Elias National Park. The lodge had 12 modest cabins spread out over the property, connected by gravel roads that crunched underfoot no matter how softly you attempted to go. It was June 2022, and for 3 months, park was essentially my entire world. Our closest neighbor was 40 miles away. The guests that week were mostly hikers and photographers, the type of people who came to Alaska specifically to escape from the outside world, and cell service was completely non-existent. The only way to communicate with the outside world was through a single landline in the main office, which on good days crackled with static. On most nights, the silence was so complete that it felt like we were the only people left on Earth. Civilization. David, one of those guys who never seemed to stop talking, was always making jokes and making everyone laugh during meals in the main lodge. He and Amanda had been sleeping in cabin 7 for 3 days with their friend Troy. Was more reserved and quiet, but she had a way of keeping an eye on everything around her as if she were taking notes in her head all the time. Troy was somewhere in the middle, friendly enough, but mostly solitary, and they would spend their days hiking the trails around the property, returning home every evening exhausted, covered in mud and bitten by mosquitoes, as 3 friends embarking on a wilderness adventure. Their relationship seemed normal enough, but there was an underlying tension between David and Troy in particular that I couldn't quite identify. The day everything went wrong began like any other day, with me spending the majority of it repairing a broken water heater in cabin 3 and replenishing supplies in around 900 p.m. The main lodge was filled with mosquitoes, and that peculiar twilight that never quite fades to complete darkness during Alaskan summers, and the weather had been exceptionally warm for June. I could hear David's voice growing louder as they got farther away, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. I saw David, Amanda, and Troy walking toward the bathhouse, which was this little wooden building about 100 yards from the main lodge. Troy was carrying a towel and appeared eager to finally get cleaned up after their long hike, guests argued. Occasionally, especially when they were exhausted and coping with the isolation. His tone caused me to pause while I was locking up the office, but I dismissed it. An hour or so later, I was reading in my tiny staff cabin when I heard voices outside, initially assuming it was just other guests returning from the evening activities, but the voices were becoming closer and more agitated, and then I heard Amanda's voice, sharp and panicked, saying something about Troy not being there. They were going from cabin to cabin, knocking on doors and asking if anyone was home, so I put down my book and listened more intently. Had seen Troy. The frantic intensity in their words had the hair on my arms to stand up. I took out my flashlight and went outside when Amanda saw me and ran over, her face pale even in the dark light. David, immediately behind her, had this crazy expression in his eyes that I had never seen before. Amanda kept claiming that Troy had vanished following a confrontation close to the bathhouse, but both of them seemed to falter when I pressed for more information. Every time I asked a question, the story they told me changed. Amanda first claimed that Troy had a fight with a stranger who was prowling the bathhouse, and David then jumped in and claimed that the stranger had been there 4 hours simply observing people come and go. However, when I asked what this stranger looked like, for example, David insisted he was shorter and had a beard, while Amanda described a tall man with dark hair. Their descriptions were so dissimilar that it seemed as though they were discussing entirely different individuals. David was pacing back and forth, repeatedly running his fingers through his hair, while Amanda continued to wring her hands and look around anxiously. I told them we should check the bathhouse first, and perhaps Troy had just wandered off to cool down after whatever argument had happened. But as we walked toward the building, I noticed David kept looking at Amanda with these brief, meaningful glances that made the whole situation feel wrong, as if they were acting out some sort of staged panic instead of being genuinely worried about their friend. The bathhouse was absolutely deserted when we arrived, but there were obvious indications of some sort of struggle. The wooden seat outside was overturned, and the soil had scuff marks that suggested someone had been dragged or had fallen hard. These looks made my skin crawl. When I suggested that we use the landline in the main office, David quickly said that we should search the property first, claiming that Troy probably just went for a walk to clear his head and would be back any minute. However, the way he said it with this forced calm in his voice made me realize he was crying right away and that they needed to call the police. The 3 of us spent the next hour searching the trails with flashlights, calling Troy's name and receiving no response. Every shadow seemed dangerous, every sound made us uneasy, and I agreed to assist them in their search, but I was already preparing to call the police as soon as we returned to the lodge. When we finally gave up the search around midnight, I was exhausted and truly concerned about Troy. So I told David and Amanda that I was going to call the state troopers from the main office. Amanda kept asking what we were going to do, but David kept diverting the conversation away from calling for help. At that point, David's he took hold of my arm and suggested that we wait until morning, claiming that Troy would likely arrive alone and that we would be wasting everyone's time. Amanda objected, stating that they should call Troy's family to inform them of the situation, and they immediately began arguing. Front of me, and I could hear the desperation in both of their voices. Amanda was practically pleading with David to let me call the police, but he insisted that doing so would only make things worse. As they argued, I saw that David had scratches on his forearms that were definitely not there earlier in the day. And when I questioned him about them, he said he had gotten them while pushing through some bushes during our search, but the deep, new scratches resembled fingernail marks, and their pattern reminded me of someone attempting self-defense. I eventually persuaded them that we needed to call the police, and the three of us proceeded back to the main lodge. I unlocked the office door and heard David and Amanda breathing heavily behind me, and the building felt eerily quiet. When I picked up the landline phone to dial, there was no dial tone, just total silence. I jiggled the cord and checked all the connections, but the line was dead. I told them I'd drive to the closest town in the morning to report Troy missing, but David quickly offered to go instead. Amanda was growing more and more agitated by the minute, pacing around the small office and muttering that they needed to get help somehow. David immediately said the phone lines probably went down because of the weather, but there hadn't been any storms that day. I suggested that we all stay together until we learned out what had happened to Troy, and then I saw David and Amanda exchange another one of those laden stares. He claimed to know the region better and could get there faster, but I was dubious of his desire to leave. Chose to hold off on making any decisions until dawn, and I offered to let them stay in the main lodge rather than return to their cabin. Amanda accepted right away, but David appeared hesitant, stating that he wanted to return and retrieve some of their belongings. I watched him make his way toward cabin 7, and something about his deliberate and swift movements convinced me to follow him from a distance. David walked inside for maybe 10 minutes, and when he emerged, he was carrying a big duffel bag that appeared to be much heavier than it should have been. He was only retrieving clothes. I took my flashlight and crept out the lodge's back entrance, hiding in the shadows as I headed toward their cabin. I was able to return to the lodge ahead of him, but I pretended to be sleeping in one of the lobby chairs when he came back. Amanda curled up on the couch, but I could tell she wasn't really sleeping either, and he had something wrapped in a towel tucked under his arm, and he kept looking around nervously as he walked back. Of the night in that main room, and I doubt that any of us slept for a single minute. At 4:30 a.m., when the sun finally rose, I proposed that we all return to the bathhouse area during the day to see if there were any more hints as to Troy's whereabouts. When Amanda got up and said she wanted to look again, David immediately objected, saying we'd already looked everywhere and wouldn't find anything new. After a brief pause, David agreed to accompany us, but as we made our way to the bathhouse, I noticed that David kept putting himself between Amanda and me, as if he was trying to exert control. The morning light brought to light details we had overlooked in the darkness, such as the presence of what appeared to be dried liquid droplets on the bathhouse's wooden steps and the more disturbed ground surrounding the building than I had first thought. Amanda pointed out a ripped piece of "we shouldn't touch anything that might be evidence," David urged as she began to reach for the fabric that had caught on a neighboring shrub. Around 7 a.m., however, he spoke in a tone that made me question whether he was attempting to destroy or preserve the evidence because of the forced authority in his voice. We hardly ever had air traffic that early in the morning, so when I heard the distant sound of a helicopter approaching, David's face went white, and he began talking quickly about how they should probably go back to their cabin to pack up and leave, But Amanda was staring at the helicopter with this at first. I thought someone else had called about Troy. But then I realized that was impossible because our phone lines were down. And she whispered something about hoping it was help. The helicopter landed in the clearing near the main lodge, and two state troopers and a paramedic got out. When the troopers asked if we were the ones who had reported a missing person, David interrupted me to say that there had been a misunderstanding and that Troy had simply gone for a walk and had most likely already returned to town by himself. The trooper appeared dubious and requested to speak with each. Amanda was the first to speak to the officers, and David, who was perspiring in spite of the cool morning air and fidgeting with something in his pocket, kept trying to persuade me that we should tell them that everything was okay and that Troy would eventually show up. However, the paramedic arrived and informed us. The paramedic reported that Troy had crawled to the road and flagged down a passing truck driver who had called for help on his CB radio. They had discovered Troy approximately 2 miles downstream, close to the old mining road. He was critically injured from multiple stab wounds and was already airlifted to a hospital in Fairbanks. Amanda began to weep, but these were tears of terror rather than relief. And when I looked at David after hearing this news, his face had turned absolutely grey, and he was staring at the ground as if he were trying to vanish. The soldiers arrested David that after discovering the knife wrapped in the towel he had taken from their cabin that afternoon. Amanda admitted that she had assisted him in moving Troy's body following the attack, claiming that David had lost his temper during a dispute over money Troy owed him, and that they had panicked when they believed Troy was dead. The phone line had I quit my job the next day and never returned to Alaska, and I still wake up sometimes wondering what would have happened if that truck driver hadn't discovered Troy in time. Amanda received a reduced sentence for cooperating, but David was charged with attempted murder after being cut by wire cutters discovered in his bag. Music, my Uncle Tim, who believes that Wi-Fi is a government ploy and that real life begins when your boots hit mud, would take me fishing in remote Alaska most summers. On that particular trip, we were camped just outside Bethel, along a bend in the Kuskokwim River, where the bank slopes down in a jagged mess of roots and packed silt. Even though I still had to sleep in the smaller tent, I recall feeling proud when I received my first piece of equipment, rod, boots, and even a small fillet knife that spring, when I had just turned 13. The sun was out, but hazy, filtered through low clouds that made everything look softer, quieter. I had set up by the water with my tackle box and a half-warm thermos of black coffee that I wasn't really supposed to be drinking. It was afternoon, and Tim had hiked up river a ways to check some traps, leaving me with instructions to keep the fire going and not wander far. I remember watching the surface like it was a movie, with no phone or other distractions, just that constant silence of water and wind, while the current was slow that day, pulling drift and bits of morse in broad arcs. I initially believed it was Tim playing pranks, but then I heard a voice from the trees behind me, a kind but odd tone like someone trying not to startle a stray dog, and when I turned around, I saw a man halfway down the slope leading. I didn't recognize him. He wasn't from the campgrounds or the little store we visited in town. He was wearing a camouflage jacket that appeared to have been drenched in mud and left 4 years, and a wool beanie that was stretched over his head as if he had put it on without making sure it fit. Something about the way he stood motionless while speaking bothered me. He claimed to be a local guide, carrying equipment for a group of hunters and requiring a second pair of hands. He smiled, his mouth slightly wide to reveal a missing canine teeth. He never moved, and even when he pointed to the woods with his chin, his hands remained behind his back. When I asked him whose outfitter he worked for, he sidestepped the issue as if I had asked for his social security number, and then he laughed, making a dry, shallow sound, and replied, "I recall feeling my knees tense, not out of dread exactly, but as if my body had already made up its mind before my head caught up." He pointed deeper into the woods, claiming it wasn't far, just across a crest. I told him I wanted to fetch my boots, stalling. He appeared strong enough to carry a couple crates. I noticed that the back of his pants were soaked up to the thighs, as his boots sank into the soft dirt near the water's edge, leaving deep, wide prints as if he had been pacing that shoreline for some time. He stepped forward as if he hadn't heard me, but it felt way too close. It was darker, muddier, as if he had been kneeling somewhere wet for too long, and not from walking through shallow river water. He looked back toward the trail, but there was no equipment to be seen, only thick brush and a jumble of alder branches snapped low as if someone had just pushed through them. The man didn't answer immediately, but I answered no without even considering it, just saying it aloud, plain and hard, the way my uncle had instructed me to speak. Something ever felt wrong. His face remained the same, but his jaw tightened once, and he continued to stand there, staring as if I had said nothing at all. He then murmured something under his breath that sounded like, "They never learn," and sort of laughed through his nose. I felt a strange need to keep talking, moving, or doing something, because quiet felt frightening, so I backed away, being cautious not to turn around and using the river as a sort of barrier. I continued walking backward until I came to a log that indicated the trail back to camp. "You don't want to be out here alone when it gets dark," he continued, taking a cautious, purposeful step closer to me. There was no danger, not precisely. He was more akin to declaring a fact. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and ran without checking to see if he was following. I didn't hear footsteps, but I also didn't trust the man because of his strangely calm and flat tone, which sounded like he was reading a weather report. By the time I got to the tents, I couldn't tell if I had been gone for 10 minutes or an hour since everything seemed the same, but the trees appeared denser on the way back, as if they were leaning in, and I remember ducking under branches that hadn't been low before, felt unsteady, as if the world had been pushed a little sideways. I couldn't find Tim, and for a moment I thought that man might have reached him as well, but then I noticed smoke rising from the fire pit. A few seconds later, he emerged from behind the truck with a wrench in his hand, wiping grease from his fingers, and asked if we departed that same afternoon after I told him that we needed to pack things early, and that he hadn't caught anything. Tim didn't press for information until we were halfway back toward town on the gravel road. I told him the truth about what had happened, and he became very quiet, not angry, but focused, as if he was already going over maps and faces in his head as he asked what the man looked like, what he said, and if Tim didn't say anything for a while. And when we arrived in town, he stopped briefly at the ranger station while I waited in the truck with the windows cracked and my fishing ROD in hand. I told him about the wet pants, the missing tooth, and the part where he kept his hands out of sight. Still in the back seat, undamaged, back at the motel that night, as we were dining, the news was playing in the background, and I was barely listening until Tim turned up the radio. Someone had sent out a missing persons alert. There were no conclusive leads, but the article stated that a 15-year-old boy named Alex was last seen talking to a man in camouflage who may have been local. The picture of the missing child struck a chord. Alex was last seen 4 days prior, just outside another campsite not far from ours. I didn't get much sleep that night, and I kept thinking about how quickly things could have gone wrong if I'd said yes. He was taller than me, but there was something familiar about his face. He was just an ordinary teenager trying to enjoy the outdoors, and he probably didn't anticipate his afternoon to turn sideways. It's not like I did anything heroic. I just pay attention to that part of myself that tense up when things isn't quite right. I still consider what may have happened if I had followed. If I had paused even a little longer when he told me that I didn't want to be alone out there. His voice was so calm, not irate or irritated, but just certain, as if he wasn't speculating about how things might turn out. I never saw the man again, and no one was ever jailed, as far as I know. Tim said we'd stick to spots closer to town for a time. We haven't returned to that location since. Alex, the other boy, was never located. His name occasionally appears In places like this one, and each time it does, I consider reporting the encounter again, but in reality, I've already stated what I know, so perhaps posting here is just a reminder. I still don't know why I didn't turn around that day. I guess it was just denial, but I didn't want to admit it. Anyone reading this should trust their gut, even if it doesn't make sense at the time. Something wasn't right. My son Mason, who was 16 years old, was very athletic and often threw his gym bag in the back seat like he owned the world. I had taken the weekend off, and we were supposed to be traveling to a wrestling tournament in Satna. The drive down from our town was familiar, having been done twice before for other school events, so I told myself it would be a quiet ride, perhaps even a chance for us. I picked up both of us from the dental office, packed us up, filled up at a Chevron near Kenny Spur Road, and figured we'd make good time before sunset. We were about 30 minutes south of Stirling when I spotted the pickup, which had an older matte grey paint job and dark tinted windows, nothing ostentatious, just enough to blend in so we could chat without interruptions. Somewhere past the final gas station, it slid into my lane behind us. At first, I didn't give it much thought because the highways are long and largely deserted, and cars can often stay together 4 miles, but this one kept close to close. The driver matched my speed precisely, maintaining the same close distance, almost as if he were linked to us. I repeatedly checked the mirror, anticipating it to pass, but it never did. I even pushed over to the right shoulder, slowing down enough to welcome it past. In an attempt to appear uneasy, I pointed it out to Mason, who was staring at his phone when he looked up and murmured something along the lines of creeper vibes. I checked it again, increased the speed a bit, and then decreased it down below the speed limit, so he wasn't mistaken. My dad used to warn tailgaters by tapping the brakes twice, but it didn't make a difference, so I changed lanes without any explanation. The truck duplicated everything. There was no honking, no flashing lights, no engine revving, and it was still behind us. It was deliberate, not aggressive, and that was what made it worse. Just the steady pressure behind us, as if we were being herded somewhere, made me realize that this wasn't just someone dozing off on the highway, and I didn't want to freak out in front of Mason, but it was too late to turn around, and the phone signal wasn't strong enough. Stretch, I instructed Mason to use the Maps app to find the closest lighted rest area or store to pull over at. We located a rest stop approximately 10 minutes in front of us, which was hardly, it was only a faded icon on the map, but it was better than continuing to drive with this guy stuck to our bumper. I tried to remain calm, but my knuckles were starting to hurt from holding on to the wheel so tightly, and the rest stop wasn't what I had hoped for. I slowed down and pulled in anyway, figuring that if the truck passed us, I'd just wait a few minutes. It was a gravel pull-off with a single flickering street lamp, a rusted vending machine that probably hadn't worked since the early 2000s, and the single unmarked portati tilted slightly in the mud. There were no cars, no people, just the dull hum of the nearby river and the wind blowing through the trees. It followed us in, slow, steady, and confident, but it didn't pass within minutes of getting back on the road. I felt Mason sit up straight, and I could tell he was attempting to seem undisturbed by the way he held his breath. I didn't recognize the brand exactly, older Chevy or GMC, maybe late 90s, but there was something odd about the front grille. The truck didn't park next to us. Instead, it placed itself behind my car, blocking the exit as if it had practiced the maneuver. No movement, no door opening, just the truck sitting there, engine still running, low idle rumbling through the silence like a warning. It appeared to be homemade, reinforced, as if someone had welded extra bars across it. My headlights reflected off the tinted windshield, but I couldn't see inside. "Mason, don't leave," I said. Mason muttered that he was already filming when he snatched my phone and said, "No signal." I urged him to stop filming, since he was a smart kid who had swung his camera over and angled it low against the dashboard with almost any hand movement, even though I didn't think anyone would hear. I was going to honk once, maybe to frighten whoever it was, or warn someone close, but the truck's driver's side door broke open before I could, only a few inches. I couldn't understand the action, but it felt deliberate, as if they were telling us they were observing and making a decision. Then it closed again, nothing else. No one got out. We were surrounded by dense trees on the left and a steep ditch on the right, and I kept thinking that, if I drove forward across the grass, I may get stuck. That's when it stopped feeling like paranoia and started feeling like a trap. The truck slid forward an inch, just an inch, and I couldn't stop myself, so I just stayed there, doors locked, engine running, and I screamed, "What the hell do you want?" Mason grabbed my arm, trying to calm me down, and whispered, "Mom, wait." I instinctively leaned on the horn, loud and long, and it reverberated into the trees and the deserted highway beyond. The driver was still motionless, only the engine humming like it had always done. It jolted back, then quickly reversed, kicking up gravel behind it, but it didn't completely leave the lot. It stopped again beside the exit, then halfway turned toward the road as if the driver was undecided about whether to run or wait. The wheels bounced hard over the edge, the undercarriage scraped, but we made it through the muddy patch and onto the far side of the rest stop. I didn't look back until I was back on the highway, and when I checked the mirror, the truck was gone. I put the car in drive, aimed directly at the ditch, and floored it. Mason stopped recording, and we drove in silence for the next 20 minutes, until we came to a more populated area, and I was able to breathe again. I turned into a busy grocery store parking lot and forced him to transmit the video to my email just in case. Nor on the road behind us, nor in the lot, simply vanished. I didn't care if they thought I was being theatrical. I knew what we had just gone through wasn't typical, that it wasn't road rage, and we waited there for long before I contacted the police. It was something more sinister than a practical joke. It was taken seriously by the trooper who met us. I demonstrated to him the video, and he immediately recognized the truck. Although he didn't tell us everything, he said that the driver fit the description of a person they had been looking for 4 months, who was linked to at least 3 other tales of harassment on the Kenai Peninsula's roadsides. Late afternoons are always the goal, women who drive by themselves or with children. The conduct was getting worse, but nothing had turned violent. He said Mason's video was the most convincing proof they had yet, and it might provide them with the information they needed to arrest someone. What followed was never told to us, most likely for legal reasons. They didn't follow up, but I will never again drive that section of highway without a passenger and a full tank of gas. Mason also ceased requesting drives alone himself. He still makes jokes about how his camera saved the day. Additionally, he might be correct. That tiny bit of intuition could have prevented us from becoming just another unsolved case. All I can hope is that whoever was driving, whomever believed that sort of stuff was a game, should know they made a mistake that evening.